you very much for coming tonight. And tonight, I'll bet pretty much everybody here has had history classes and textbooks, particularly those of us, most of us are of a certain age, where they begin with some statement about European immigrants arriving in the New World, facing and ultimately conquering the wilderness. And each step of the way, as Europeans moved inland into the continent, this image was remade and reborn as people moved along. The American wilderness was a wild tangle of untamed nature, and that's a central theme that started really with Columbus and emphasized by the Pilgrims and the whole ceremony with Thanksgiving. After American independence, the new ideal, or the new wilderness, I should say, actually moved to the other side of the mountains, and we all got stories of Daniel Boone leading colonists across the continental divide into the Appalachian Divide into the wilds of Kentucky. And then the Northwest Territories were the next wilderness to be conquered. That is Ohio and Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And that was then followed by treks out into the Great Plains and to the west. Now these pictures were, and for most people still are, an essential part of our founding mythology. And in each of these stories, the landscape tended to be seen very much as pristine, often untouched by human hands. There are popular songs that talk about nature in the New World as being like a bride waiting to be married. And often Native Americans were mentioned in these stories that people told. But generally the emphasis was on the low impact they had on the environment. Now, until recently, Native Americans were also treated in history books as kind of like the way we talk about animals, the way they were either impediments who needed to be hunted down along with other predators like wolves and coyotes. You might want to think of Wes Studi, the fantastic actor in Dances with Wolves, or later on in 1992's Last Mohicans. Or Native Americans were often seen as someone who could be domesticated. Much like Graham Greene, another great actor who played Kicking Bird in the old movie Dances with Wolves. Or you could also think about the way we talked about Squanto in the issue with the first Massachusetts colonists and so on. Alternatively, they could be seen as antagonists who needed to be removed to reservations, essentially a defeated and exhausted people. This is the classic end of the trail. You know, you see this in all kinds of different variations in photos and in paintings, on statues, and so on. A great example of this is the New World, movie made in 2005 starring Colin Farrell. Some of you may recognize him. It's the Pocahontas story, essentially. But in that movie, the Indians were seen as naturals. They're referred to, in fact, as naturals. And they are, how can I put this? The movie makes it clear that Pocahontas and the other Native Americans in that movie are given some agency. They were people who had some say in their destiny. But interestingly, the village of Powhatan, which is a real village, which was run by a man named Powhatan, he was a very powerful ruler over a very populous, agriculturally based society. But they showed it in the movie as if it was just kind of like this kind of random scatter of wigwams and so on in and around trees, as if they didn't have the ability to cut down trees and just kind of had to fit their wigwams in various places. And here you can see them dancing and being at one with nature and all that kind of good stuff. In reality, Powhatan's village was a very large town, we know this, with streets, palisades, and public buildings built on top of mountains. Here you can see, this is an engraving by Theodore de Bry in 1590, and it shows the fact that their agricultural fields were neatly arrayed, and here are things going on a mound, and the chieftain's house, and various other public houses and private houses, it was really clear that it wasn't just kind of a bunch of wigwams thrown out in the middle of the forest, but in fact it was a laid out town. Now, Native Americans' presence on the landscape, however, didn't get into the, our own, didn't get in the way of our need to refer to the environment as wild and unaltered. Even great mounds like those mapped at Ashland in southwestern or southeastern Wisconsin, like this, where the Ira Lapham mapped this in 1856. When did Lapham do that? About that time, right? The very earliest European explorers in Wisconsin knew about these. But these mounds were often attributed to somebody else other than Native Americans. And often it was ascribed to some kind of a lost race who was then destroyed by the red barbarians that the Europeans had run into. And for example, that's why this is called Aztlan, because it was thought that these had been built by the somewhat civilized Aztecs, and it didn't get a local name like Wauwatosa or Waukesha or something like that. Now, as early as the late 19th century, archaeologists had shown that the mounds, such as all of these that were mapped out by Lapham, were in fact clearly made by Native Americans, but that theme of the naturalness of Native Americans just kept sticking to us. And even today, in our supposedly enlightened times, the impact of Native Americans on the landscape is really downplayed or ignored in most history books, most popular books on the history of the American Midwest. And while we usually don't refer to Native Americans as uncivilized brutes anymore, and we tend to acknowledge their humanity, they're still usually portrayed as having very little impact on the environment. This is the way we usually like to view them, as people with a very light touch. And it's really still common in documentaries. Pardon me, I've been speaking all day to little kids. And I don't speak well to begin with. But in interviews, it's not hard. I mean, every time I listen to NPR or public TV and watch some documentary on American archaeology, someone always comes up with the notion that Native Americans were living in harmony with nature, taking only what nature could give, or living off the land. And we've replaced the picture of Native Americans of being, savage with that of at best the woodland elves from Lord of the Rings, or at worst, it's a bunch of tree-hugging hippies. And I'm here tonight to offer you an alternative to any of those views. Okay? They were neither what the earliest European colonizers saw as savage, uncivilized people, nor were they card-carrying members of Greenpeace. They were, in fact, and in many ways still are, just like us, non-Native Americans, human beings who were living and making a living on and with the environment, and they were shaping the environment, altering it to suit their purposes for whatever it was that they needed to do. And in very sophisticated and well-planned out ways. One of the things that's always been a big paradox is, on one hand, we like to talk about, the white man's gone out and conquered the wilderness, at the same time acknowledging the agricultural genius of Native Americans. The whole corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, the notion that you plant the corn and the beans can go up the corn and the squash puts the leaves around and keeps the weeds down, and they all work together. Okay? That is completely out of context with the notion that these are people who only are taking what nature gives them. These are people who have a very sophisticated understanding of how you plant beans along with corn to replace the nitrogen in the soil, and how you use leaves as mulch and so on. So they knew what they were doing. And tonight I want to show you a little bit about how that environment was manipulated by Native Americans, not just for agriculture, but other purposes as well. And I'm going to discuss how archaeologists use techniques from both the humanities and the sciences to do that. And I'm going to focus on southern Wisconsin because I've been doing that for 25 years. And I've just started to work up here and get some background. And hopefully in a couple years, if you don't mind this, perhaps I could give you a better talk about the environment and human relationships in Door County. And we'll see. But I'm using as my example tonight 12th to 15th century Native Americans living along the shores of Lake Kashina. And it's important to note that the general idea, though, of what I'm going to show you about what we call the Prairie Peninsula actually does work for up here. So here's the region I was interested in, and here's Lake Kashina, where UWM has had an archaeological field school for now, well, going on 25 years. And we've been working on the northwest shores of the lake. And I want to talk in particular about the single most important environment in the Prairie Peninsula, and that's the oak savanna. And I want to talk about how archaeologists and other historical scientists help us appreciate how the landscape would have looked and how it was used before the arrival of Europeans. Now the data I'm using come from paleoecology or paleoclimatology, and regardless of your personal political persuasion, there is no doubt that the climate changes. And climate changes bring about significant changes in human behavior. And they have demonstrably affected human behavior at numerous times in our past. And the time period I'm going to talk about now is also one of those periods of this climatic change. Depending on how you define it, the Little Ice Age began either around AD 1300 or AD 1500. And since I'm going to talk about both those centuries and beyond, it doesn't matter. So, in either way, it coincides with major changes in Wisconsin's cultural and natural landscapes. And the number of data sets we can use to talk about paleo environments and environmental settings are varied. So, one of the things I want to do here is talk about, here's Lake Kashina right there, here's us up here, and we have down here the Prairie Peninsula, and here the northern forests, and this is the tension zone. And through time, the tension zone has moved up and down depending upon the climate. So 5,000 years ago, the tension zone was way up here, and then about AD 1500, the tension zone was probably down around here. So the forests have moved north and south, and the prairies have moved north and south. And the time period I'm talking about is actually, the climate was probably not wildly different from where it is today, although during that period then, the tension zone did move south a little bit. Now, one of the things that we can do is to understand that movement of the tension zone is we can look at pollen, which is the male gamete of plants, and they can be identified to species. And we can also look at phytoliths. Phytoliths are the silica shell that goes around the plant's body cells. And when the plant dies, the organic part of the plant goes away, but these little itty-bitty tiny cell linings made of rock stay in the soil. And we can sample those and we can get a look at those and see what kind of plants live in. And they're essentially forever. And between those and pollen diagrams, we can get an idea of how climate changes. So these are two bogs. One's in just at the Wisconsin-Illinois border, and one's farther south in central Illinois. And here you can see, at 15,000 years ago, down in central Illinois, the land was spruce and tundra. We know this by looking at the proportions of different species of plant pollen. By around 14,000 years ago, it changed to an ash tundra forest. By about 11,500, it was a mesic deciduous forest, basically what's around here. And then an oak hickory forest, but by about 8,000 years ago, it turned into prairie and remained prairie all the way through the historic times. Now, in southern Wisconsin, what we have here is ice. There's nothing here because there's a glacier here. The glacier goes away about 12,000 years ago. We have a spruce forest that then becomes a pine ash forest, becomes a mesic deciduous forest until about 7,500 years ago, and then it becomes an oak hickory forest dominantly although there is some prairie, particularly about 5,000 years ago, we have the height of a warming and drying trend, which brings in some prairie. But it's this oak hickory forest I want to talk about because this kind of belies what I'm talking about now, the notion of savannas. Now, other things we can use to talk about prehistoric environments or pre-contact environments are seeds. So here you can see a squash seed right there, and there's a chenopodium seed, and a bunch of other seeds. And this is from a coprolite, that is dried fecal remains. That's what somebody ate. That was their dinner. We call these macrobotanical remains. And we can also get them from charred nut shells, charred seeds, things that fall into what we call archaeological features at archaeological sites. And we can also look at soil columns. We use geology to look at changes in the depositional patterns. Fast deposition usually occurs under grassland environments. Slower depositional patterns is usually under tree environments. Grasses aren't very good for stabilizing soil. They have shallow roots, and the soil actually can erode underneath grass and move it along. So there are various places we can look at those shifts to talk about drier, warmer conditions for grasses and cooler, wetter conditions that would mean trees. But we also can look at historic data. And one of those historic data are the maps and the notes of the General Land Office Survey. Now, the Land Office Survey was put in place to divide up the land. Once Europeans took control of the territories, the Northwest Territories, and started removing Native Americans out of these territories, they just had to have a way to divide the land up so they could sell it. And one of the things they did is this Land Office Survey. Now, the survey was done using what we call the Public Land Survey System, and was underseen by the General Land Office, which was an agency of the Treasury Department, and later became part of the Department of the Interior. And the way they did this was you have a survey team, which was composed of a surveyor who had a compass and a transit, and you had two men who held on to ends of a chain, and an axeman. That was a typical crew. And what they would do is they'd start at a known spot, like right here, and they would simply go in a straight line north for 1 mile. Then they put a post up, and then they do a 90-degree turn and go 1 mile, put a post up, do a 90-degree turn, put a post up, do a 90-degree turn, do a post up, go back up here, and start again, up, over and around. And they would do this, and they put posts every mile, and they would do this 6 miles by 6 miles. That makes up a township. And each township has in it 36 1 mile by 1 mile sections. The section is 640 acres. You can easily divide this. If you know where you're going, if you go a ½ mile and cut it in half, you've got 320 acres. You go and cut that in half and quarter it, so you would call that a quarter section. A quarter section is then 160 acres. You can then do the same thing. You can quarter that and get down to the 40 acres. So the very popular 40 acres in the mule, the north 40, the south 40, whatever. And you can divide that down to 10 acres. Then you can easily divide that down to 2½ acres. And then you can divide that down to 1¼ acres, which is why quite often when you see houses being sold, they're at 1.25 acres or something close to it, because that was a very small unit. If you're in the more or less urbanized area. In rural areas, you get 10 acres or 40 acres being sold. And that's the reason why we do it in those lots. So, a chain was 100 links. 100 links is 66 feet, otherwise known as 4 rods. All these kind of bizarre terms. A rod equals 16½ feet. 10 chains is a furlong, or 1/8 of a mile, for those of you who always wondered why you have horse races in a particular length, a furlong, talking furlongs. But essentially 80 chains is a mile. And the axeman led the way. He cut through vegetation so the surveyor could see straight forward. And the surveyor at each marker post would have his notebook, and he would write in his notebook and make notations. So he'd say something like, set a post from which a black oak 18 inches in diameter bears south 63 and a half degrees east, 90 links, and a white oak 12 inches in diameter bears north 50 degrees, 1.5 degrees west, 183 links. And what that was, is he's sitting there with this over the post, and he's taking his compass and he sights in a tree. He describes that tree, they measure that tree, and then the axeman would take a chip off the bark of the tree, called blazing that tree, and hence blazing a trail. And usually, depending on what instructions they were working under, usually it was 2 trees, sometimes it was 3 trees that they would do. Now when you bought property, you would have to go out, find, well, starting from that known point on that map, and you would just go up and over, and then you'd find the post, and you go, oh, here's a post, oh, there's a black oak with a blaze on it, and there's a white oak over there, blaze that way. This is where my property starts. And that's how you got your property. So that's our land system, okay? Now the other thing, though, they talked about anything else they found when they ran into them. They talked about crossing rivers, leaving fields, leaving swamps, and so on. And at the end of each line, the surveyor wrote a brief description of the mile they just traversed. And that would be describing the surface of the land, the quality of the soil, and so on. So, first rate, rather low, part meadow and part openings. So a meadow is any kind of a field of any sort. And then an opening is a savanna, an oak opening, barrens. These are all essentially meaning the same thing to them. Some good timber. The also says over here, site of an old Indian town. So as you go through these historic records, you can see not just the natural landscape, trees and so on, and rivers and marshes, but they also recorded cultural features as well. And this is a really useful resource for biology, for ecology, and for archaeological studies in the Midwest. Most Midwestern states are done this way. And we can use this, and a lot of people have, to reconstruct the late pre-contact environment of southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois. And it turns out that in our area, about 20% of the region contained wetland associations. That included tamarack, swamps, marshes, wet prairie, and open water. Upland forests were about 30% of the region, and dry prairie accounted for about 9 to 11%. The remaining amount of property in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, which is the northern end of the Prairie Peninsula, which is an extension of the plains out into this side of the Mississippi, about 40% is oak openings. There's an awful lot of the land was this oak openings. Yeah, those numbers right there. So the exact proportions of plant communities varied across the region. It's a really complex mosaic pattern, as I think this map will show you. So what you can see here is that we have all this white area. These are oak openings. This is forests, maple beech for the most part. The dark is marsh land and so on. But you can see it's a really complicated environment. It's very complex, it's very variegated. There are some trends. There's more oak openings and prairie on the south and west. And the farther to the north and east you go, the more closed forest you get. And it's just a nice old forest environment. We got our marshes, got your upland prairies, and these are what oak savannas or oak openings look like. Basic definition is at least 1 tree per acre and no more than 50% canopy. More or less is what you would use to talk about oak openings. or savannas or barrens. They're all actually slightly different in terms of where they are in the landscape and the makeup of the soils underneath them, but they're all generally very similar things. And you can see that, when you're talking about oak barrens, you're talking about a varied kind of environment. But they all have one thing in common, which is that they are relatively open spaces that are forest soils. Now, this is important because prairie soils are incredibly difficult to cut through. It wasn't until they brought in the steel plow that they were able to get through and make it useful. Crossing the Great Plains was a big problem. But when we look at it, the deep forest is a very quiet. It's not a very diverse place. The marshes that I showed you are really very productive. You can get a lot of good things out of the marshes. The prairie was, like I said, it was common. Small patches are found around here, and it gets more as we go to the west. And it's a tough place to be. It's the least productive place for humans, except for later when you get to bison hunting. The bison show up in large numbers after about AD 1450, but then there's that, as you all know, the big crash and boom, or boom and crash of bison populations in between 1500s and the 1900s. And it wasn't just a European massive killing of bison that caused the near extinction of bison. They were already on a downward cycle even before the Europeans showed up. So, cruise through this. The oak savanna, though, itself is pretty much the best of all possible worlds. You have access to the ultimate edge environment. You've got forests, you often have marshes or swamps, and as I mentioned, you have forest soils that you can use the implements that were available in Native Americans. Bison hoes, a stone hose, shell hose, to break forest soils up. And you can't do that with prairie soils. So that's really kind of nice to be able to do. The thing about it is, you get some really nice edge plants. You get things like plum and mulberry and walnuts and various nuts of sorts. You can get a number of different kinds of plants growing. Goosefoot, which is you probably pull out of your garden on a regular basis. Or purslane, which is the bane of my existence in my garden. Once it gets established, you can't get rid of it. They're edible, but they just take over if you're not careful. Then there's wild rice in the marshy areas. And then the animals that were available, white-tailed deer, American elk. Now I mentioned that bison became big after 1450, even as far east as Indiana and Ohio. In Illinois, they were small herds. In southern Wisconsin, they were small herds, and they were probably what we would refer to as forest bison. Maybe just a handful. It wasn't like this massive, over to the horizon pile of animals. But we do know that the bison were here because we find them at archaeological sites before AD 1450. We find them as early as AD 1200. And then you get your range of other little guys who hang out on forest edges, red squirrels and raccoons and wolves. And of course in the marshes we get our geese and our mallards and lots of turtles and heel splitters. And the reason I'm showing you all these is because these are all species that we find at our archaeological sites, and we know humans were exploiting them. So not only are they theoretically available to you in these oak savannas, people are actually eating them. And fish like drum and bluegill and catfish are very popular fish throughout the Midwest. And here's what's important. In order to maintain the savanna, you have to have it burn. An oak savanna is a transitional environment. I mentioned it's forest soils. That's because it wants to be a forest. But if you keep burning it, you get grassy plants that grow. And that makes it really nice. So if you're into agriculture, well, if you're a forager, a hunter-gatherer, it's good because you got all these resources around you. You can hunt and gather, and it's great. But if you are an agriculturalist and you don't have a steel plow, or you don't have steel axes, living in the woods isn't much fun because it's hard to cut down all those trees. Living on the prairie isn't much fun because it's really tough to break the sod. But if you're in that savanna environment, you've got a loose soil that you can use non-steel tools on to break up and form ridges or hills and so on that will allow a very efficient form of agriculture to grow. And in North America, we begin with things like purslane and our goosefoot or chenopodium and sunflowers. We call that the Midwest Agricultural Complex. And then later we see maize and beans come in. This is what happens if you don't burn them off. This is at 20 years after, this was a known savanna environment at a college campus in northern Illinois. They stopped burning it, and in 20 years, this is what you get. You get all these little massive amounts of undergrowth and hazel, oak grubs, prickly ash. Later on, you get black oak and maples, and finally you get elm and other deciduous trees, but it takes a while for those to come in. And so, based on the fact that 40% of the environment in southern Wisconsin was savanna, we're pretty confident they were being maintained by Native Americans. And in fact, we now have direct evidence in the form of stratified fires at a number of places in southern Wisconsin that these had to have been artificially set. So the savanna was an anthropogenically produced fire-based ecosystem. And the surveyors, those early surveyors I was talking about, they often record evidence for after Native Americans have been removed for reversion of this, not just experimentally, but in fact. They talk about thick underbrush consisting of hazel and vines. So I got that. But they also talk about something even more directly. So there is much old improvements throughout this township, consistent of rows similar to corn rows, where it's plain to be seen and covered with the present growth of timber. White oak, red oak, bur oak, sugar, which is maple, linn, which is basswood, elm, black ash, tamarack, beech. Undergrowth of hazel, haw, hawthorn, ironwood, grapevines, prickly ash, and blackberry. So here's a surveyor in 1836 talking about the forest cover of old cornfields. So these surveyors who came through knew that there were agricultural populations living here beforehand, that they weren't surveying any kind of wilderness. They were surveying essentially agricultural fields that had gone fallow. But instead of going fallow like we think of it in terms of like, some grasses being grown on it, they get returned to forest. Here's a nice example of ridged fields that are overtaken by forest growth. And they're hard to see, but the snow shows you. There's one right there. There's one right there. There's one right there. There's one back there. So these are ridged fields, and you would have planted on top of those ridged fields. And then in between, ridge fields probably help with drainage, and they also help a little bit with extending your growing season by a day or two because of colder air and frost sinks. And so just an extra 1 foot or 2 foot elevation can give you a couple extra days, maybe even a week of frost-free days. So just really quickly, I'm probably already blown past my time. Well, I've just got a few minutes left here. Just talk a little bit about how people use this environment in the 11th to 15th centuries. So this was a term, Oneota is what we used to talk about these folks. They lived in small villages. They hunted mammals and they fished. They had extensive maize agriculture. They did not have platform mounds and very few burial mounds. It's not normal. Some of you may have heard of mound builders and these. Well, the folks we call Oneota, and they're not a tribe. There's not a tribe of Oneota. Oneota is just an archaeological term we give to certain kinds of pottery. So we refer to them as Oneota, but they didn't refer to themselves as Oneota. Okay? And then after AD 1000, we see them hunting bison as well. So they're growing maize, and they're eating maize in quantities that are equivalent to the big southern groups, like the Mississippians at Cahokia. You may have heard of Cahokia. It was the largest city in North America, north of Mexico City. And the folks up here are eating maize at the same level as those folks down south, which we didn't know until very recently. As a colleague of mine in Illinois, and then one of my students wrote his dissertation using dogs as a proxy for humans, and was able to show that dogs' diets are elevated in maize. And so the populations are up here are eating maize at about the levels that we see in southern Illinois and Missouri. And they weren't all over the place, but they were settled in various localities. So there were some groups lived around Lake Kashong. That's where we've been working for the last 25 years. There were some out in La Crosse, some up in Marquette County, some on the middle of Fox, and then there were some from Green Bay all the way up through to Rock Island, and a handful of others. We call these localities. And they interacted with each other, but they were independent of each other. And I won't go into all the reasons why we know that, but they were. They were autonomous groups. And they actually kind of follow along the settlement around these oak savannas. And so here's where people lived in southern Wisconsin. Here's Lake Kashong right here. And these are all areas of oak savanna. These are effigy mounds, and here's our later Oneida folks. But they're very closely located along savannas. These areas that were more forested or more prairie, you see there's very few people living in there. It's an interesting phenomenon, and they just weren't scattered all over the landscape. They were in targeted locations. They lived in villages that were generally circular. This is our excavations out at this one site, Crescent Bay, and these little brown things are houses. So they had long houses and they had rectangular houses, and you can see what's going on here is they are in a circular pattern surrounding an open area where there's nothing. It's empty, it's a plaza, and there's a giant post. And that would have served as a ceremonial post. This is what one of the houses, rectangular houses, look like. Double rows of posts, internal benches for sleeping, and the entrance is over here. And they would have had a hearth in there, and some features. It looks somewhat similar to these historic wigwams, but not the same. Not exactly the same, they're slightly different. And we also have some long houses, like so, that are, again, different from historic long houses, but relatively similar to Ojibwe-style long houses. I'm not saying they were Ojibwe, because they weren't, but they look different from later historic groups, wigwams, and long houses who moved into the Illinois-Wisconsin area. They made really nice pots, cord marked with this kind of really interesting kind of curvilinear decoration. And they used tools that were essentially relatively informal, but triangular arrow points and very small steep-sided scrapers for working hides. And we know they worked deer hide, we know they worked bison hide, we know that they hunted bison, we know that they hunted rabbits, we know that they shot humans. We know this because we've done blood residue analysis, protein analysis on these, and those are the returns that we get. Up here in Door County, we've gotten tools with beaver and rabbit polish or proteins on them. So out of the Cove site. Other stone tools, I mean, they're informal. They're not really fancy. Not like earlier folks who had really fancy big bifaces and spear points and so on. But they did do a lot of cultivating of plants. They ate a lot of maize. They ate a lot of squash. And they did eat beans, but very late. Beans come in after about 1350s. Corn comes in around 80,000. And then they had special plants, including tobacco, tobacco was used ritually. They didn't smoke tobacco the way we did, kind of recreationally, but tobacco was smoked as part of initiation rites, cleansing rites, and so on. And a weird thing happens though. About AD 1450, almost all those Oneida localities I mentioned are abandoned. There's still some in the Chicago area and in northwest Indiana, and there's some in the Green Bay, Door County, and Rock Island. Rock Island's the other one for sure. These are kind of likely. And they change subsistence. They're still eating deer and small mammals like everybody does. And they're doing seasonal bison hunts. But they use much less corn. They're still eating corn, but not nearly as much. And they're eating a lot more wild rice. They've stopped using burial mounds, and they're living in smaller villages than previously. And so if you look at this map, all these places are abandoned between 1450 and 1650. And we have some evidence for some of the occupation at that time. Rock Island is the best we have. And we're not sure why, but this happens all over the Midwest. But around 1450, huge portions of Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan are depopulated. And we don't know why, but it probably has to do with the fact that we have the Little Ice Age coming in and causing disruption. Plus, by 1450, we have Europeans already making their presence known on the coast of Canada and New England, and they're trading. They haven't landed, but they're trading. Fishermen are trading. And we know that as soon as that happens, Native Americans in the western Great Lakes start hunting and trapping beaver and other fur-bearing animals to trade across the Great Lakes. And so we get fur trade items from the Europeans long before Europeans show up. And we also get diseases from the Europeans that show up before the Europeans do. And so we think that that's got a lot to do with it. A lot of population movement, a lot of sickness, and a lot of competition. So much so that if you try to figure out who was living where when the Europeans show up, you go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different places to look at who was where. You get all kinds of variations on who was in what territory at what time. And that's because they changed and they moved around, and there was a lot of jockeying for position, even before the Europeans show up. So in pre-contact times, there was a lot of disruption. And what I wanted to just say then was that what happens is when Europeans get here, they come to a land that has been altered significantly for at least 5,000 years. The savanna environment's been around for 5,000 years and it had to have been artificially set. First by foragers, then by agriculturalists. But just before Europeans show up, things go fallow as populations start moving around and they let the savanna go back to the forested environment. And that helps to support that notion that there's a wilderness out there that needs to be conquered. It follows a narrative. But if you really pay attention to both the historic narrative and the environmental stuff, you can see that there wasn't a wilderness, that the surveyors who were talking about these things got there just as things were being disrupted. And when we're talking about restoring the land and restoring it to nature, my argument is, and my suggestion is, you have to understand that human beings are part of that natural environment, and they have fundamentally altered it here for the last 12,000 years, but particularly the last 500 or 800 years before Europeans got here. And so if you're going to restore the land, you have to understand what you're restoring it to. It's not some pristine nature, but it's an anthropogenic landscape. And that's what I have to say. So thank you. Time for some refreshments. I know I've blown past my 40 minutes. What the gentleman asked basically about naming. Did Europeans name the tribes, the native tribes, or did they have their own names for their tribes? And basically the answer is both. That when Europeans first came here, they ran into people whose political structures they really didn't understand very well. Most Native American groups weren't highly structured. Some were, but many were really based on kin groups. The most important thing to you was your family and your relatives who were closely related, sometimes on your mother's side, sometimes on your father's side, occasionally on both sides, but mostly you're either matrilineal, where all of your inheritance and your relations were on your mother's side, or you are patrilineal, which is on your father's side. Well, that was really too weird for the Europeans to figure out, and because people switched all the time. So you'd have, if you were in a group and you got mad at your brother-in-law or your sister-in-law or whatever, you might just pack up and go to another one of your lineages, one of your relatives, on the other side of the state. And so they were very, we would call this fluid. They were very fluid groups. And the Europeans couldn't handle this. They were already very rigid, hierarchical state structure. So they kind of imposed their own worldview and said, all right, these people who are hanging out in Red Banks are the Winnebago, or they're the, and the Winnebago, okay, well, they didn't call themselves Winnebago, but that's an English messed up version of a French messed up version of what other groups call them. They call themselves the Ho-Chunk. And so today when we call people Ho-Chunk, that's because that's a anglicized version of what the Ho-Chunk call themselves. But they used to be known as the Winnebago. And same thing with the, we used to call some folks Chippewa. Well, now they're Ojibwe, okay? Because that's closer to what they call themselves than, oh, excuse me a second. I just shut this thing off, sorry about that. The naming system of tribes was a way for Europeans to kind of lump people together. It was a convenience for them. Okay? And then the native groups kind of had to go with that because they were trading and they needed to form alliances that could give them leverage over one another and better trade deals with the French and the British and so on. So the naming of groups kind of became an amalgam of both native and European ideas of what a tribe should be. And if you look today, even today, there's an awful lot of variation of what we call federally recognized tribes. Okay, and there's political and treaty reasons for that. But the Europeans wanted to make treaties. And to have a treaty, you had to have someone who was signing for all of the people in his or her tribe. Well, that wasn't an easy thing to do. And it turns out that a lot of these treaties are essentially fraudulent, one way or the other. And but some tribes had elected representatives, some had inherited leaders, some had very, very low levels of any kind of leadership. It was just kind of a consensus-based nature. So that made it tough for the Europeans to figure out who was who. And so many of the names that we use today are basically were imposed in one way or another by colonial powers. So, anybody else? Questions? Yes?
Well, I'd like you to comment on something that I've been working on for a long time. I knew a metallurgist, and we both had interest in Native Americans, and he said, Dave, I know why they never had to wheel. He said it was because there are no deposits of tin ore on the surface in either North or South America. That Native Americans were actively mining and working with copper a great deal, almost simultaneously with the Copper Age in Europe and Asia. But because there were no deposits of tin, they could never have the accident of bronze. And without bronze, they could never develop fire and smelting to the point where they would ever find out that rusty red stuff could be useful.
Pretty much, yeah. The basic concept of metallurgy for Native Americans was hard hammering and annealing copper. And the copper, most of you probably know, Isle Royale and Keweenaw Peninsula, There's some deposits over in Marinette. Those are the most famous ones. There's also copper deposits in Georgia. They're very pure copper. It's like 99.9% copper and just a few impurities. And we can geochemically source these using a couple different things. One of my students just finished his doctoral dissertation doing that. And it's, and that's kind of cool. Then of course you also get gold and silver. The gold, there's gold mines and so on farther south in Central and South America. Silver, we find meteoric silver, particularly at one particular time period, 2,000 years ago. There's a group of folks that we, again, archaeologists refer to as Hopewell. In their burials, you will find they'll take a wooden spool that's used as an earring and cover it with a little bit of copper, and then they'll hammer silver on top of it. And the silver is meteoric silver. Apparently they know from the composition of the additions to the silver that it comes from meteors, not from the earth. So that's kind of cool, but they did not ever smelt. And in fact, pottery making, they didn't even use the wheel for pottery making. North Native American ceramics are all handmade. They didn't throw pots at all. So there are some examples of toys out in the American Southwest that have wheels on them, little wagons. But that's it.
But without bronze, you can never make a saw. And without a saw, you could never cut a practical wheel.
Well, you can do it with pretty ingenious ways of getting a wheel around. But yeah, without metal, it's a lot harder to have a vibrant wood. Yeah.
Cahokia obviously was gigantic. How large did the settlements in Wisconsin generally become?
Good question. The ones we've been working on around Lake Kashang probably were no more than, say, 200 or 300 people at most. There was one site that was a group of people who were settled by some folks who came out of Cahokia, and we don't know whether they're relatives or whatever, but they settled. That's that site of Aslan. The largest population there was probably no more than 300 people. So pre-European contact, population sizes were probably fairly small. In the later part, like after say AD 1450, out at La Crosse, they may have been a little larger. There may have been 300 to 500 people living in the village, but we did not ever get the kind of metropolis like you get down in the American Bottom, which is down near St. Louis, which is where Cahokia is.
Right.
Yes.
Is there evidence that they had wells and understood sanitation, or?
Not really, no. In fact, historically speaking, some of the fur traders, particularly with the agricultural groups like the Mandan and the Hidatsa out on the plains, mentioned that you could always tell when you were getting close to a village because the rivers were so gross. And they smelled terribly. And these are people who are recording this who thought that bathing was a bad thing to do. It was unhealthy. So it had to be pretty nasty. And in fact, Mandan and Hidatsa houses were allowed to fester with vermin and so on for about 5 to 7 years, and then they were abandoned. And most of our villages here in the eastern U.S. are made of wooden posts, and basically the way they were lived in for probably no more than 5 to 10 years. And in most cases, there's seldom an example of the houses being rebuilt and the posts being reset, which suggests that basically they lived until the house till it became unlivable, and then you just moved over 10 meters or whatever and built a new house, and then you could throw your garbage into the old house. And that's how we find them. These houses are then filled in with garbage, and it shows up as a black stain in the ground. And so that was their basic way of that. Now there are some areas on rivers where we can find where they actually did go to the river bank and threw their garbage over the river. Because we can excavate the riverbank and you can see the deposits of debris. So there's a lot of variation in that, but they were not into running clean water lines or any of that kind of stuff. Yes.
Would you be able to find the survey books for, say, like Door County?
Yeah, matter of fact, I was just mentioning to Coggin that I messed up and I gave her the second to last version of the PowerPoint I was going to show you, because just before I came here, I went and got the township and range data for right here, the map and then the surveyor's notes, and stuffed that in there so I could show it to you. And then when it came time to, it was like, oh, it's not there. So, but yes, it's there.
You can get them online.
Yes, you can get them. You can go to the Wisconsin Historical Society and look up on their webpage, look up General Land Office or Public Land Survey, and you can actually click on location, a map will come up, you click on Door County, and it will give you the scanned in notes and maps of the surveyor. Now, the surveys were done mostly in the 1830s, and then they were hand copied over in the 1850s and 1870s. So there was more than one copy, and they went to the different courthouses, county courthouses, and then a lot of county courthouses copied them. So sometimes what you're seeing is a copy of a copy of a copy, and oftentimes mistakes were made in the copying of those. And you may have noticed the writing is pretty poor. It takes a while to figure out what they mean sometimes when they're scribbling things down in their they're doing these in February or whatever, and it's 20 below zero, and they're writing it down. So, and then whoever redid the surveys in 1850, they were trying to copy that, and they were doing it in a hurry because they weren't getting paid much. So they're tough to read, but you can get them. And the maps are easy to read, actually. The maps you can see, and they're very interesting, and they're free on the Historical Society's webpage.
Was there any evidence of damming or irrigation or draining?
Yeah, kind of. Those ridge fields, that's kind of what they're doing. It's not irrigation per se, but they are often in places where it appears that they were trying to drain fields, at least allow for drainage. And then, as I said, also that it picks your plants up a little bit. I mean, if you do raised garden beds at home, you get a couple extra days of frost free, and so they're doing that too. But out west, you get irrigation. In the American Southwest, we know that they do irrigation. So, in fact, there are rock channels that go from uplands down to the cornfields that are below the mesas, and they're channeling whatever rainfall comes is being channeled down there. But around here, there's no irrigation that I know of. Yes?
You mentioned trading going on 1450 pre-contact. My understanding is a lot of the archaeological work done with the Vikings, at least, did not really show much evidence of trading. How is this occurring?
So, when we talk about the Vikings show up around AD 1000 at Lonsdale Meadows in Newfoundland. And they don't do much trading, except arrow points, essentially. They manage to hang out for a while before they have to abandon. And that's probably a combination of bad relationships with the local indigenous people and the environment goes bad. The little ice age kicks in, and around 1300, and they've got to leave because farming is no longer tenable. You find a little bit of Viking steel or iron in some Inupiat and Inuit villages up north, but you don't find much in Canada, or you don't find any in the United States that I know of. There is on the East Coast. There is evidence of I'm trying to think, not Spanish, but I'm trying to think of the name, Basques, the Basques who were doing cod fishing off of Newfoundland. There is some Basque artifacts from some, what would be otherwise pre-contact indigenous villages on the coast there. And then later there is some English material that shows up before the English actually set foot on land. So it does look like, and in fact, when the Pilgrims showed up in 1640, or when Cabot shows up, he's met with English-speaking natives. They've already learned how to speak English from fishermen, so they're pretty shocked. They think, oh, we're here, we're the first guys here, and they weren't. They were just the first Englishmen to show up and put their feet on the ground there. But natives have been bringing canoes out to the ships for 100 years already at that point. So,
What was the longevity of these indigenous people pre and post European influence?
wow, that changes and fluctuates through time. If you go to 1,000 years ago, to 1,500 years ago, the average age, depending on how you want to measure it, is probably about 33 years, which sounds terrible, but it's largely due to a very high early infant mortality. If you get past the first year, you're in pretty good shape. But it's not much different from European mortality rates at that time. But then when agriculture kicks in, and people start doing maize agriculture in a major fashion, you get a big decline in the age. It goes down to about 30. It goes from about 33 down to about 30, sometimes maybe even 29. You have more people on the landscape, but maize is not a very good food, it turns out, if that's what your diet is. And it turns out that once they get into agriculture in a big way in the Midwest, about 70% of their diet is maize for most people. That's a lot of corn you're eating. And it also means your teeth are rotting. And when your teeth rot early, that means you get a lot of infections. And when you get a lot of infections in your, a lot of abscesses and so on, that means you get a lot of systemic infections and heart disease. Myocardial inflammation and all that kind of good stuff. So bad teeth equals overall bad disease. So one of the ways we can measure the lifespan is to do an estimation of height, of average height. And in the Midwest, the average height of a male, let's say, 1,000 years ago is about 5'10". If you look at early contact, it's down to about 5'8". So they dropped a couple inches in height, and that goes along with the loss of.
So they relate that to protein in the diet, you think?
Yeah, lack of protein essentially. Yeah, you're eating a lot of corn, lack of protein, and then a lot of immunocompromisation. Essentially, you get the systemic infections, and then you get things like tuberculosis that pops up.
Is there any studies done with the influence of alcohol?
Oh, that's a whole other story. Yeah, and that's actually beyond my competence. I don't do historic or post contact health measures. That's not my thing. But yeah, in a lot of groups, alcohol was a problem. But you also had the issue of measles and smallpox and so on that just made population crashes. We had perhaps a 90% loss of life in North America before Europeans even run. I mean, you get the Europeans meeting people on the East Coast, but out here we get these big population crashes long before the Europeans show up. And I think that's largely because of things like smallpox and so on that's being passed from east to west by intermediary native populations. And so, yeah, by the time Europeans are here in the Midwest and relating to the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee and so on, they've already gone through like a real disruption in their lives, and both cultural and biological. Yes?
So, what, before the whole corn or farming, but you showed pictures, a picture of their village,
Mhm.
like with rows of corn.
Yep,
And when was that?
that was 1590.
So, before that, they were foraging, eating fish and wild rice and,
Yep, before 80,000. Maize becomes popular about 80,000.
and why is that when they were doing really good without it?
If you could tell me, we could write a really good article. So it turns out, for example, here in the northern Midwest, maize shows up first about 2,000 years ago. But it only shows up in kind of ritual contexts and in very small amounts, and people aren't eating it much. And then, after 1,000 years of them knowing about maize, it suddenly becomes a very popular food. And at 80,000, it becomes about 25% of their diet. By 1200, it's 50 to 75% of their diet. And we don't know why.
Was it easier to come by than foraging and hunting?
I don't know that it was easier to come by. It provides you with a very stable food, more or less, because the way most Native Americans ate their corn is you grew a crop and then you put that, you either dried it and hung it up in your house, or you put it in pits in the ground and you let it sit, and then you grow more corn, and then you would eat last year's corn crop and then put the corn crop you have, you put it away. So you always had a year's worth of food sitting in the ground. And you'd make these pits, you'd line the pits with grass, you could put the corn in there, the grass would then get moldy and serve as an insecticide and so on, and like mold on cheese, right? So you get this moldy cheese, all you do is you scrape away the mold and the cheese underneath is good. The same thing, that's how you can store, people always ask me, how can you store corn in the ground? Sounds, kind of nasty. Well, you line the corn, or you can use the baskets, you even line it with baskets and put the corn in there. But archaeologically, when we're digging, we find these pits that were used to store corn and wild rice, and we have one pit out at my Crescent Bay site in Lake Kashon that we got about 5,000 purslane seeds from, so they were actually eating the purslane out there. So, but they were storing it in these pits. And but the idea was you keep the corn going, and you never eat fresh. Well, I take it back. You eat fresh corn every year. You have a ceremony called the green corn ceremony. It's just as the corn is getting ripe, you take a certain part of the corn crop, a certain amount of it, and you boil it up, or you eat it actually just fresh. Or you boil it up and you eat it, and that's that's a religious ceremony. But the rest of that corn goes into the ground, and you eat the old corn after that. And the corn that they ate isn't like sweet corn. They had two kinds of corn, two big families. One was dent corn, which is essentially field corn, and then they had flint corn, which is hard popcorn. And so to eat popcorn, what you do is you have to get those kernels off. You have to soak them in lye, and then you process that and get the lye off to soften the shells, and then you boil it, and you get pasote or hominy is what it is essentially. Yeah.
That seems like a whole lot more work than just going out and eating berries and stuff.
This is true, but what it does do is, like I said, it allows you to have that extra year's worth of food stored away. So if there's a big drought and the berries don't show up, you've got the corn. And they never stop eating berries, and they never stop hunting. Deer is the most important animal from 12,000 years ago up until well after European contact. Every archaeological site in the Midwest, the number one food item is meat, until you get to these agricultural villages where we now see that they're eating a lot of corn, but the number one meat part of their diet is deer, always. Deer, elk, and then later bison, and then smaller animals. You do get coyotes, all those little guys I was showing you. But really deer and corn in the the last 500 years is what people are eating, staple. Fish is important, but it's only about 10% of the diet. So, yeah, although up here it's a little higher. Up here it's probably more like 20.
They didn't migrate at all then,
Oh no, they moved all over the place.
but I mean, just, they stayed locally, or did they go?
Oh no, they wandered all over the place.
But I mean, when you say wander, I mean, like, down as far as Texas or something like that?
So in 1700, we have records of the Miami who were living in what is now Fort Wayne, Indiana. They would leave at the end of spring and walk across Indiana, Illinois, and over across into Iowa and hunt bison all summer. Then they pack up the bison meat and they'd come back at the end of fall. That's a long way to go for what they did it. So moving was a long distance, not far. As far as we can tell, as far back as say 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, there was probably a network of people to move copper from the Keweenaw Peninsula and so on, all the way down the west shore of Lake Michigan, down around the Chicago area, and across into Ohio, and down into Kentucky even. And so these people either walked all the way, or they had trade connections all the way. But they knew of folks who were very far away. They went and got obsidian from Obsidian Cliff National Monument in Yellowstone and brought it back here to use as stone tools 2,000 years ago. Now, whether they physically went themselves and got that, or it was being traded, we don't know yet. It seems like it's probably a network. But people are very mobile.
What did they use for money though? I mean, you just didn't.
You traded. They didn't have a currency per se.
Just
Most
trade
groups. Most groups did not have what we would consider money in the modern sense of money.
coin.
That's a Chinese invention, and then the Europeans climbed onto it. But we did not. Native Americans did not have anything like that.
What's the earliest evidence of human habitation in the Midwest?
In the Midwest, well, the glaciers are here until about 12,000 years ago when they go up, and people filter in almost immediately after that. Now, the earliest in the New World, we'd have to start a fight with people. It ranges. Some people think about 15,000 years ago. Some people think as far as 33,000 years ago. But there's a lot of contention there. But we do know that by 12,000 years ago, people are filtering into Illinois and up into Wisconsin by that point. They're following the glaciers as they move north. Yes.
Did the potato ever make it into this area from
Not to my knowledge.
along indigenous trade routes?
Nope, not to my knowledge. The potato is up in the uplands of the Andes. I do believe that by late pre-contact times, there is some trade that brings potatoes up into Mexico, and corn goes over into the Andes. But I don't think there's any evidence of potatoes here before pre-contact. Apples are brought by Europeans, but we do have wild cherry and we do have grapes here prehistorically. Same thing, we have raspberries, we have blueberries, gooseberries. These are all here naturally.
Pumpkins?
Pumpkins come up from Mexico. Squash, the very first gourds are brought up from the southwest about 5,000 years ago. So when you think of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, squash is up here 5,000 years ago. Corn, 2,000, but doesn't get used until about 1,000 years ago. And then beans are not used until about AD 1350 or so. So they don't come as a package. They're all independently brought in. And then historically, they're a thing, the three sisters. But that notion of them being three sisters is a very new thing for Native Americans at the time. Even though they have origin stories that suggest that it goes back thousands of years. They don't. Yes?
So are the history books being adequately updated?
No. Not at all. And
Did you want to think about that for a while?
no, you know, what we teach kids in schools is pretty woefully unresearched, let's put it that way, for the most part.
Can you recommend a couple books?
Sure, for kind of general, if you want to know some interesting things about Wisconsin, there is a good book on mounds that by Bob Birmingham and Amy Roseborough. I don't know what year. I could actually, is there a way to put some references up on the Crossroads webpage? Hagen, do you think?
Not yet, but we're redesigning it, there will be,
You know, just a link to something, but yeah, so,
there will be eventually.
okay.
It hasn't happened yet.
Maybe Master Gardener books.
Master gardeners can do it.
Could do that, okay, I can do a little bibliography and give that.
Dr. Bob, if you send that to Cogden, we'll get it and we'll put it on the Door County Master Garden website.
All right, I'll do that, I will,
Under the education tab.
You think I'll help?
wow, we got some smack going on out there.
What's your opinion of the book 1491?
That's Jeremy, what's his name?
Yeah, I can't remember the
Yeah,
name.
the same guy does Guns and Steel, Germs and.
No,
No?
Jared
No.
Diamond.
That's-
Jared Diamond is that's
But
that.
he didn't write that.
Very
He
well
didn't
developed
write
in
that one.
that book.
Yeah, who does I don't remember who does 14. I don't read most of those books because they tend to basically take a little bit of information that they got some researcher that they pay minimum wage to collect from the library. Then they put it together and they write it and they you know, and then they just kind of throw it out there. For Jared Diamond, for example, it's terrible. I mean, he takes a little bit of something that's interesting and useful, and then he just kind of runs with it and lays out stuff that is completely unsupportable by the evidence. And I did not read 1491 because one of my colleagues told me it was basically the same thing. I wouldn't tell you not to read it because it's probably an interesting book. But really, if there are very few books that are written for the general public that are more than just kind of a general guide to something interesting. So, but yeah, so the whole notion of like most of Jared Diamond stuff is, you know, it's like, okay, interesting, but it's really, pretty much unprovable or unsupported. Yes?
So what you've been able to describe about what wilderness was through the archaeological stuff, where do you publish that kind of stuff?
Oh, I publish it in professional journals, and I could give you a list of my things, and you could just put them on your bedside table anytime you couldn't sleep. You just pick that baby up. By the time you get through the abstract, you're sleeping like a baby. But yeah, where I publish generally are journals like American Antiquity, the Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology, the Wisconsin Archaeologist. We do, by the way, the Wisconsin Archaeological Society, who did help to fund the work we're doing out here at the Cove site this year. They are the oldest archaeological society, is that right, Brian?
Correct.
The oldest ongoing archaeological society in the country, and they publish the Wisconsin Archaeologist, which is the oldest or the oldest continuing. There's another journal that
Oldest continually published since 1901.
Since 1901. And so if you want, you can do that. You can join the Wisconsin Archaeological Society. It's $30 a year, I believe, and you'll get two journals a year. And it's all focused on Wisconsin archaeology, and most of them are readable by, without necessarily putting you to sleep. So, yes.
Canoes, did they build their own, the Indians, or did they?
Yes, they did.
And did they use them?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the Wisconsin Historical Society they've got they have the one that's about 1,000 years old, and now they've just found another one that I think they're dating to 3,500 years ago. And here in the Midwest, down south, they tended to use dugouts, and then up in the Great Lakes, they use birch bark frames more often. And so rivers were very important and were used quite often as ways to get from one place to another. But they did, as I mentioned, they did not hesitate to walk cross country. And so there was a trail that went from Detroit, Michigan to Chicago to Milwaukee, out to Minneapolis, and all the way out to Seattle. And that is today 94, right? US 94. US 30 goes from Philadelphia all the way out through Fort Wayne, Indiana, over to Chicago, and then out to Portland, I think maybe, is where it ends out on the Pacific, somewhere out there. But that's US 30 now. And that was at one time a trail that was then turned into military road by the US, and then eventually turned into a highway. So many of our major highways actually started out as just walking trails. So, and they, like I said, they went a long way.
Are you familiar with the prairie turnip?
I am not familiar with the prairie turnip.
I know it was a staple on the Great Plains. I was wondering if it's listed as a native plant of Wisconsin, but
I'd have to know the scientific
it was
name.
Pediomellium esculentum.
Not
And
that I
it's
know.
really, it's almost as nutritious as a potato.
No, I don't. I do know there's also the Jerusalem artichoke, and the thing is, archaeologically, we haven't found it in the Midwest. So they may have been using it, but we don't have any. Things like tubers and so on, to be preserved, things have to be charred and turned into charcoal. Otherwise, or under very specific wet conditions, you can get them. So most, like greens and tubers, we seldom find evidence for them because of the preservation issue that we have. So mostly what we get are seeds and things that are being charred and turned into stew. So, but
I am going to cut this short because tomorrow Dr. Bob and his colleagues are going to be out with grade school kids again. And
This is true.
it takes a lot of energy to work with grade school kids. And I think we all need to just go home and get some rest.
I need to go to dinner.